August 17, 1945. The jungle outside Manila still smelled of smoke and sweat, though the war had ended 2 days before. The sky was too calm for what the prisoners expected. Along a narrow dirt road, rows of captured Japanese soldiers and nurses sat in silence, dust clinging to their uniforms, eyes lowered to the ground. They had heard that Americans didn't take prisoners. They had been told mercy was weakness, and that the only honorable way to die was by their own hand. So they waited, back straight, hearts racing, for the sound of the firing squad that never came. An American jeep rolled into view, sunlight flashing across the metal like a blade. Several soldiers stepped out, rifles slung casually over their shoulders. The prisoners stiffened, a few whispering quiet prayers in Japanese. One woman, barely 20, clutched the hem of her torn uniform, tears already streaking the dirt on her face. Her name, recorded later in camp records, was Lieutenant Aki Tanaka, a nurse from Okinawa. She had treated wounded soldiers in a cave hospital until American grenades ended the war above her. When she saw the soldiers raise their weapons now, she closed her eyes. But instead of gunfire, she heard a voice, calm, steady, almost gentle. "Water?" One of the men said, holding out a canteen. When she didn't move, he knelt and poured the water slowly into a cup, setting it within her reach. The others followed, handing out ration cigarettes and medical supplies. The prisoners looked up in disbelief, exchanging uncertain glances as if the entire scene were a cruel trick. What none of them knew was that American command had already issued strict orders. All surrendered personnel were to be treated according to the Geneva Convention. The war was over, but the fight to prove American honor had just begun. Private Robert Mallory of the 25th Infantry Division later wrote in his letter home, "They bowed to us, but we were the ones ashamed." That line would resurface decades later in a Smithsonian exhibit about moral courage during wartime. The camera of history lingers on that moment. Japanese soldiers, hollow-eyed and trembling, bowing not to their executioners but to their rescuers. The Americans, still wearing the exhaustion of battle, seemed almost awkward in their compassion. One medic wrapped a prisoner's infected arm. Another offered a bit of chocolate from his own pack. Nearby, a wounded Japanese officer broke down. Sobbing, the rigid mass of Bushido cracked wide open. This was not the image either side had been taught to expect. For years, imperial propaganda had painted Americans as savages, while American soldiers had learned to dehumanize their Pacific enemy. Yet here they stood, stripped of myth and hate, sharing a moment of raw, uneasy humanity. The tension in the air was still thick, every sound amplified, every movement cautious. But the rifles stayed down. A brief touch of irony emerges here, that the soldiers who had once sworn to kill each other now fumbled through acts of kindness, like men unlearning the rules of war. One American, seeing a Japanese nurse's confusion, offered her his canteen with an apologetic grin and said, "Don't worry, it's just water." She laughed nervously, the first sound of life in a day defined by fear. As the sun dropped lower, shadows stretched long across the camp. The prisoners were loaded into trucks, not toward execution pits, but toward medical tents and holding areas. Some looked back, expecting the gunfire to start once the trucks moved. None came. Only the rumble of engines and the heavy silence of disbelief followed them down the road. That night, under a dim canvas sky, Lieutenant Tanaka wrote in her small, dirt-stained journal, "They did not kill us. I did not understand why." Her confusion was not unique. It was shared by thousands of others across the Pacific who had surrendered expecting death. But in that single day, in that humid August light, mercy quietly broke through the discipline of vengeance, and the war for the first time truly began to end. By the spring of 1946, the world had begun to rebuild, but for those who had once awaited execution, Every sunrise still felt like a borrowed miracle. The Japanese prisoners, many of them women, medics, and conscripts, were now living behind barbed wire that no longer represented fear, but survival. The American camps, scattered across the Philippines, Guam, and Okinawa, became unlikely havens of rehabilitation. The Guard were no longer soldiers of vengeance, but caretakers of fragile peace. Each morning, roll call was followed not by punishment, but by breakfast, rice, soup, sometimes even bread. The same prisoners who once braced for gunfire now lined up for medicine and inoculations. Records from the U.S. Army Medical Corps show thousands of treatments administered to Japanese POWs between 1945 and 1946. Antibiotics, surgeries, dental work. The irony was sharp. The same army that had burned Tokyo now fought to save the lives of its defeated enemies. One Japanese nurse, later identified in Red Cross transcripts as Yumi Sato, recalled her disbelief when an American orderly offered her sewing needles and cloth. He said, "Fix your sleeves, ma'am," she remembered, her voice trembling decades later. Ma'am. He called me ma'am. That small dignity, the simplest recognition of personhood, was enough to undo years of propaganda and fear. Letters began to flow home. Some were intercepted, others preserved in archives. "I am still alive," many began, followed by hesitant descriptions of American compassion. One prisoner wrote that the guards let them plant flowers near the camp gate. Another described hearing the sound of laughter again, American and Japanese voices mixing awkwardly, cautiously, but together. Meanwhile, beyond the fences, the United States had begun its massive occupation and reconstruction of Japan. General MacArthur's reforms aimed to remake the nation. New constitution, women's rights, democratic ideals. But the groundwork for that transformation had already been laid in these quiet, humane gestures toward prisoners months earlier. Compassion had become policy before it became philosophy. There were moments of humor, too, the kind that history rarely records. One American sergeant reportedly taught a group of Japanese POWs how to play baseball, laughing when they bowed after every hit. They had discipline, he joked later, just not the rules. Those scenes, sunlight, laughter, the clumsy exchange of language, were the first signs that the walls of hatred were thinning. But not everyone accepted it easily. Some Americans wrote home, unsettled by their own capacity for forgiveness. Others wondered aloud if the kindness cheapened the sacrifice of those who had died in the Pacific. It was a moral reckoning, not just for nations, but for individuals who discovered that mercy could feel heavier than justice. For the Japanese prisoners, the emotional transformation was just as profound. When repatriation ships began leaving Manila Bay in late 1946, many wept, not from relief, but from gratitude they didn't know how to express. Lieutenant Aki Tanaka, the nurse who once braced for death under the August sun, was among them. In her final diary entry before boarding the transport back to Japan, she wrote, "They fed us when they could have forgotten us. We lost the war, but they showed us something our own leaders never did." The camera as I drifts across the harbor, gray ships, salt wind, a nation's broken daughters staring back at the land they left behind. America had proven that victory could wear a human face. Years later, when historians would revisit these stories, they often remarked that this mercy became America's quiet triumph, the unseen victory that shaped a generation's belief in decency after devastation. It did not erase the horrors of war, but it softened the memory's edge. The film closes with that same haunting contrast. The prisoners' bowed heads in 1945, and the same women stepping aboard a ship in 1946, free, tearful, and alive. The narrator's voice lingers in the silence that follows. They expected the firing squad. What they found instead was forgiveness, and from that forgiveness, a new world was born.